I've got something super exciting for you today. Grace, you know how I've been getting more and more into knitting lately?
Oh my gosh, yes. And I've been loving watching your journey into the wonderful world of yarn.
Well, I was at the yarn store yesterday and I kept seeing these labels that said superwash and non-superwash, and honestly, I was like, what's the difference?
Oh, you're going to love this topic. It's like actually one of my absolute favorite things to talk about because, there's just so much to unpack here.
Really? I had no idea it was such a big deal.
Totally. And it's something that every knitter should really understand because, it can make such a huge difference in your finished project, like the way it feels, how it behaves, everything.
Well, for today's episode of Knitting with Mindy, could you break it down for us?
Oh my goodness, yes. I'm so excited to dive into this because there's just so much to cover about these two types of wool and how they're different from each other.
Perfect. Let's get into it then.
So superwash wool is basically wool that's been specially treated, and what I mean by that is it's gone through this really specific process to make it machine washable.
Oh, that sounds pretty useful actually.
Right. So here's the really cool sciencey part. You know how regular wool has these tiny little scales on each fiber? They're actually microscopic and they're totally natural.
Scales, like on a fish?
Laughs, kind of. But what happens is when you treat wool to make it superwash, they either remove these scales completely with chemicals or, and this is super interesting, they coat the fibers with this really thin layer of plastic resin.
That's fascinating. But wait, plastic?
Yeah, exactly. And that's where things get a bit complicated because, while superwash wool is super convenient, there's definitely this whole sustainability aspect we need to talk about.
Oh no. What do you mean?
Well, the thing is, the whole process uses quite a lot of chemicals and it creates more waste than processing regular wool. Plus, it needs more water and energy too, like significantly more.
I had no idea there was such an environmental impact.
Totally. And that's why a lot of knitters are really starting to think about this stuff more carefully. Like, you have to weigh the convenience factor against the environmental impact. You know what I mean?
You mentioned something earlier about how these wools take dye differently. Can you tell me more about that?
Oh my gosh, yes. This is actually one of my favorite things to talk about because, and it's really fascinating. Like when you dye superwash wool, the colors come out so incredibly vibrant.
Really? How come?
So remember those scales we talked about? Because the superwash process smooths everything out. The yarn gets this amazing sheen to it and the dye just soaks in so much better. Like the colors are they're absolutely incredible. You get these super saturated, really bright colors that just pop.
That sounds beautiful.
Right? And you know what's really cool? When you're dyeing superwash wool, you can actually be a bit rougher with it. Like you can use higher temperatures and move it around more because, well, it's not going to felt on you.
Oh, but I'm guessing, non-superwash is different.
Totally different. You have to be so careful with non-superwash. Like you've got to heat it really slowly and you can't agitate it too much or boom, you'll end up with felt. Laughs. The whole process just takes longer,
Is that why hand-dyed non-superwash yarns tend to cost more?
Exactly. It's all about that extra time and care that goes into the process. But you know what? The colours you get with non-superwash, they have this really beautiful, subtle depth to them. They're more muted, maybe, but in this really gorgeous, natural way.
So, I've been wondering about something. When you're actually knitting with these different types of wool, does it feel different?
Oh my goodness, yes. There's such a huge difference in how they behave when you're working with them. And it's actually really important to keep in mind when you're choosing yarn for different projects.
What kind of differences are we talking about?
So with non-superwash wool, it's got this amazing stickiness to it. The stitches really want to stay together, which is actually perfect for certain types of projects. Like if you're doing color work, it's absolutely fantastic because, and this is really cool, when you wash it, everything just kind of blooms together into this beautiful, cohesive fabric.
That sounds really nice.
Right? And you know what else is amazing about non-superwash? If you're doing any kind of steeking, where you actually cut your knitting.
Oh gosh, that still makes me nervous.
laughs. I know, right? But with non-superwash, those little scales we talked about earlier actually help keep everything together. And if you drop a stitch, so much easier to pick up because the yarn just, it kind of wants to stay where it is.
What about superwash? How does that feel different?
Superwash is just, it's so smooth and sleek. Like the stitches just glide right off your needles. It's perfect for things like baby clothes or cowls or really anything where you want this really soft drapey fabric. And you know what's really interesting? Because it's got less body to it, it can create these really beautiful flowing garments that they just move so nicely.
So it really depends on what you're making then.
Exactly. And that's why I always tell people to swatch, swatch, swatch. You really need to see how the yarn behaves before you commit to a big project. You know what I mean?
So, what about taking care of these different types of wool? I mean, is one easier to care for than the other?
Oh my gosh, yes. That's actually one of the biggest differences and it's super important to think about, especially when you're making something for someone else.
Really? How so?
Well, superwash is just, it's so easy to care for. Like you can literally just toss it in the washing machine with your regular laundry and it'll be totally fine. You don't have to worry about it felting or shrinking or anything like that. It's perfect for, busy parents or really anyone who doesn't want to fuss too much with hand washing.
That sounds really convenient.
Exactly. And some superwash wools, you can even put them in the dryer, but you should always check the care instructions on the label first because not all of them can handle that.
What about non-superwash? Is it a lot more work?
So non-superwash definitely needs more TLC. Like you've got to hand wash it and you need to be really gentle. You soak it carefully, squeeze it in a towel to get the water out and then lay it flat to dry. But you know what? There's something really special about that process.
How do you mean?
It's almost meditative. And a lot of makers actually really enjoy taking care of their knits this way. It's kind of like showing love to something you've created with your own hands. Plus, when you're blocking non-superwash items, they hold their shape so beautifully.
That makes sense for something special. But what about like kids' clothes?
That's exactly it. Like if you're making something for a new parent or someone who might not be super familiar with wool care, superwash is definitely the way to go. Because let's be real, no new parent has time to hand wash baby clothes, right?
So after everything we've talked about today, what would you actually recommend for someone who's trying to decide between superwash and non-superwash?
Oh my gosh, okay, so I've got some really great recommendations. Like if you're looking for superwash, the Uncommon Thread Tough Sock is just, it's absolutely amazing. And they're everyday singles too. They're both so incredibly soft and perfect for, shawls, cowls, and especially baby knits.
Those sound great. What about non-superwash options?
Well, right now I'm totally in love with Tuka wool and Arerum Natura is just fantastic. Oh, and Rauma, they make such beautiful traditional wool. You know what I mean? Like they've got that real woolly feel that's just perfect for colour work.
I think the big takeaway here is that it really depends on your project, right?
Exactly. Like if you're making something that needs to be machine washable, like baby clothes or everyday sweaters, then superwash is totally your friend. But if you're working on something special, like a beautiful colour work piece or a heritage sweater that you want to pass down, then non-superwash might be the better choice. And remember everyone, there's no right or wrong choice here. It's all about what works best for your project and whoever's going to be wearing it. Just have fun experimenting with different yarns. But before we go, I'd like to give a special shout out to a dear friend of mine, Jenny Roy. Jenny has been a great mentor to me throughout the journey of knitting, and I just want to say thanks for being such an inspiration, even today.
This has been such an amazing deep dive into wool. Thanks for sharing all your knowledge with us today on Knitting with Mindy. And yes, much love to our friend Jenny. Oh, and let's not forget her beautiful daughter Sabrina, who has probably half her wardrobe knitted by Jenny herself. That's all for this episode, so thanks to all our listeners out there. We'd also like to thank our sponsor, Nonkji's Plate Lunches. We'll see you next episode.